Hello everyone, welcome to the AHURI webinar series. Today we're delighted to have Maggie Reynolds presenting her research on the future of rental affordability. My name is Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, and we're delighted to have you joining us today. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm eager to pay my respects to elders past and present. And AHURI also, of course, obviously acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands around our country and pays respects to elders past and present, and a very warm welcome to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us on the webinar today as well. Okay, quick introduction for those of you who may not know about AHURI. AHURI stands for the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. We're a national organisation. We run the National Housing Research Program, and the research that we're going to hear about today is part of that program. Every year we fund around 20 or so different research projects with funding that we distribute. The monies from Australian governments, and we oversee the delivery of that research program and also a nascent cities research program. That's our core business here, and we do that through our university research partners, and you can see them on the screen now. If I can go to the next slide there, Susanna, just to keep people up to date with the research that we are publishing, we have a website that you can access, and I encourage you to do so because we make all of our previous research freely and easily available there. We also encourage you to sign up to AHURI News, where you can get updates about the latest research as it is released. And just to round out our offering, we also do conduct professional services as well, and I lead that part of the work, so do feel free to reach out if you're interested in that. And finally, before we jump into the actual topic of the webinar today, I also wanted to mention the Australian Homelessness Conference, which is coming up very soon in Adelaide in August. AHURI has been helping to organise that and convenes that with the support, in this case, of the South Australian government. And those of you who are interested in this area and who are working in that sector, I encourage you to come along if you're not already. All right, so just a bit of housekeeping first about today's session. So we're going to hear from Maggie Reynolds as she talks about the content and the work that was done for this particular report, which is about obviously the private rental system in Australia. You can find this report on the AHURI website, along with policy evidence summary and a standalone executive summary, and I invite you to peruse those further at your leisure. This webinar is also being recorded, and it will be available on our website later as well if you want to come back to it or share it with somebody else. We're going to be opening the chat function in the sidebar of the screen. You can probably see that. And this is really just an opportunity for those of you who are participating in the webinar to engage with one another. You may not be aware that there's quite a few people online, and there's a chance for you through that chat function to connect. And if you want to break the ice in the chat, you might want to just say what particular country you're on today as a way of opening up a conversation. We have quite a few people joining us from a range of different backgrounds. There's people from the property sector, people from government at all levels of government, and also people who work in the housing and homelessness sectors. So it's great to have you all with us, and we look forward to your engagement with one another. Thank you for those who provided input and questions ahead of the webinar, which we asked you to do. It's a bit different to what we've normally done, and that's been really helpful in helping us to shape how we're going to present the webinar today. You'll be sent at the end of the webinar a link to a survey that I encourage you to fill in, just to give some feedback, particularly as we've moved to a slightly different format and a shorter 1 hour webinar today compared to previous ones. So, on to today's webinar. We are looking at the future of rental affordability, and we'll be in the hands of Margaret or Maggie Reynolds from Swinburne University as we step through that. And we're also joined by Eliza Owen from CoreLogic, who's going to be part of our conversation after we've seen some of the results of this research and heard from Maggie. So to introduce Maggie, Maggie, or Margaret Reynolds, is the Senior Research Fellow at Swinburne University's Centre for Urban Transitions. She's an experienced data analyst, and her research interests are in affordable private rental housing supply, as well as the geography of homelessness and the spatial dimensions of disadvantage within particular population cohorts. Her research roles involve managing and analysing large and detailed quantitative data sets from a range of sources. And so we're going to obviously hear about the work that she's done with the data sets from the ABS that she'll talk about with us today. And to introduce Eliza Owen as well, Eliza is the head of CoreLogic research in Australia. Prior to that, she was working for around a decade in other areas of housing property research with the Domain Group and Residex. And she has continued to work extensively on key issues to do with the rental sector in Australia. So welcome, both of you. It's great to have you with us. And Eliza's actually come back. She's been in one of our webinars before, so good to have you returning as well. Okay, so Maggie, I welcome and thank you for joining us. Look, this is the, I guess, the culmination of what has been an ongoing series of research that AHURI has had the pleasure of publishing over a number of years. I think it's the seventh report in a series that's looked at the rental market. Yeah, so we're really thrilled to have you here. I mean, we had, going back over 20 years now, we've had some really interesting research conducted by Marion Wolfe and the late Judy Yates, who were involved at the start, and then more recently, now Emeritus Professor Kath Hulse from Swinburne University has been very critical in terms of the production of this work. But you've had a long involvement as well. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I first came on board for the 2001 project, which Marianne and Judy led. That was the second in the series, and then over the years, I've become more involved in leading the data analysis and producing the empirical results. And there's lots and lots of them, and we don't even get them all into the report. Yeah, and now I'm leading it. But yeah, Kath Hulse led the previous two projects. So I feel that I am most definitely standing on the shoulders of housing researcher giants.
Indeed, and you've had an important contribution to that work as well, of course. And just acknowledging too, I guess, the co-authors for the report today. It's great to have you as the lead author presenting, but Sharon Parkinson and Jacqueline de Vries and Kath Hulse have also contributed to this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real team effort. Absolutely, across all of the projects, it's a big team effort. So.
So just, I guess, talking first about the overall series, why do you think it's important that we've continued to to fund and to deliver this research over that long period of time?
Yeah, well, looking back on all of them, and if I can read one sentence from one of them, it says, "The study is important because of the increasing reliance on the private rental market in Australia, and particularly because of the increasing reliance on this market for lower income households." That sentence was published in the very first report in the series back in 2001. So that was based on 1986 to 1996 data. So we believe that this is still relevant today because the private rental market continues to grow, and policy settings over the past 20 to 25 years have been such that lower income households still rely on the private rental market for their housing, more so than any kind of social housing. So that's why it's important.
Thank you. So can you just, I guess, now moving to this particular report and the research that sits behind it, can you firstly start by just explaining what it is that you and your research team did and what you were aiming to achieve with that.
This is methodology, and that's my expertise. I'll try to keep it brief, but we've kept the methodology consistent over the years so that all the results are comparable. The results are drawn from customised census data, and we analyse change in 2 series of data, the 2 data sets sort of thing. The first series charts the distributions of rents paid in the private rental sector and the incomes of the households in the private rental market. So that's to have a bit of a nuanced look between at how things are changing in the market in terms of rents and incomes. And then the second series of data focuses on producing the estimates of affordable and available supply for lower income households over time. Again, that's census data, but we group the private renter households by national income quintile level. And importantly, we separate out the Q1 households, so the very low income households, households with incomes in the bottom 20% of the distribution. Yep. And then we look at Q2 households, which are, the next ones up, and they've got incomes in the, with between 20 and 40% of the bottom. And that means that across the censuses we can identify lower income households consistently. And then we apply the 30-40 rule, which is that an affordable dwelling is not more than 30% of the income of the household, and it's only relevant to those with lower income, lower incomes, not up the income scale.
So hence the 40.
Yes, hence the 40, because higher than that, it's like we believe that there's some choice involved, but more that even if they do pay 30% of their income, there's a lot more left over for other things. Yeah. When you're, well down the scale, there's not a lot left over after you've paid your rent. So it's census data. And you'll see this in the slides, but a very important characteristic of the census data is that we not only know the rent of the dwelling, but we know the characteristics of the households that occupy that dwelling. Yeah. And the key thing there is household income. Yeah. So we find out who gets the affordable dwelling. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Maggie. We'll jump straight in then to some of your slides. We're keen to see what were some of the key things that you saw and found through the research.
Okay. We're on the way. Yeah. Look, so broadly, the research aim across all the projects is to look at to what extent does a private rental market affordably accommodate lower income households. That's the aim. Yep. And why is it important? What we've just been saying, but the private rental sector is growing. It was 19.6% of all households back in 1996, and now it's 25.5%. So it's growing. The chart there also shows that it is one of the main sectors, main tenures in the housing system, and you got to remember that changes in other parts of the system will impact on the private rental market, and of course house prices are one of those, but also you can see that sort of consistent decline in social rental. That's also important. So it's growing, and it's growing at a faster rate than all households. Mm-hmm. So it means it's now becoming a greater proportion of all households.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Next one. So these results are from that first data series that I was talking about. This is the distribution of real rents in the private rental sector over time. I've put in, so we have all the rents lined up, and there's 12 points across them, and I've put those dots in just for the 2021 line there, just to show you where the categories sort of fall. One of the main things you can see here is, and looking at the long term, which we can do with this graph, we see a growth in mid to higher rents from about 2011. So that's the yellow line, which is evidence of a longer-term structural change in the market. So prior to that, rents were concentrated at the lower end of the scale between about 96 and 2006. But from 2011, they become more concentrated at mid to higher levels. And those levels aren't affordable to lower income renters.
Mm-hmm.
So another brief way of looking at that, you can see the fourth dot there on the purple line. That was $266 a week in 2021 dollars. And dwellings up to that point comprised about 13% of the market, the national market, in 2021. But in 1996, that segment of the market comprised 59% of the stock and half of the stock at 2001. So that's that shift of rents up the rental scale. And we look at that and we can ask the question then, does that matter? Like, if the incomes of the households in the private rental sector are also going up, then maybe the loss of stock at the bottom end doesn't really matter. I mean, it's of no great concern. So to answer that and address that question, we then look at incomes in the private rental sector. So that's this colourful graph. And there's two main things here. And certainly the change at the top end is very obvious. So the red bars are the number of dwellings, the number of households with income in that segment in 1996, and then you go up through the census years to the purple in 2021. And you can see the increase is quite obvious at the top end. Sorry, I'm looking at a different screen over here. The increase is, it's obvious. You can see census on census, the number of households with incomes in the upper income segments gets higher and higher. But the other thing that this graph shows is that there's a consistent number of households with lower incomes. So they don't go away. There's no decline. They don't increase. But since about 1996, and it's gone up and down a bit, there's about 480,000 lower income households. Now, these aren't quintiles yet or anything like that, but $888 a week was, I wrote this down somewhere, I think it was about 46,000 per annum as a household income. So, and with this series of data, we've got the equivalent value for that for 1996. And at each census, these values get inflated by the CPI. So so they haven't gone away. They're still there. And so bringing those two graphs together now, we show that it does matter that stock is declining. It's disappearing. It used to be a much larger proportion of the stock, and now it isn't. But the demand is still there. So we still need it. And linking to another part of our report, there's some evidence that maybe there hasn't been growth at that bottom end of incomes because some people and households are like locked out of the mainstream rental due to affordability issues. And it's hard for some people to, form an independent household. And so we see younger people staying at home longer.
Yep.
We haven't made that empirical link necessarily, but it's possible. So that's the national level results from that first data series, seeing how the rent and income distributions have changed in the private rental sector over 25 years. Do you want to keep going on to the next one?
Let's keep going to the next one, because I think that was interesting what we're seeing here now.
So the next data series produces the results and the estimates of affordable and available supply. Come across, So this first graph, I'll explain it a little bit. We're now looking, we've grouped the supply into segments that are affordable for each of the household income quintiles. Okay, so that R1 stock, we've got R1, R2, R3, R4 stock across the bottom.
Yep.
R1 stock is that supply that's affordable for Q1 households. R2 stock, Q2 households. The R3, 4, and 5 is not as important, but it does show the distribution in a different way of rents throughout the private rental sector. So in 2021, R1 stock was up to $225 a week. $225. That's the stock that's affordable for the 420,000 households in the Q1 that have Q1 incomes. So it's pretty low.
Yeah.
So the other thing that the graph there shows, the amount of that stock hasn't changed very much since this is just 2006.
Yeah.
And it has hardly increased at all. It's very little, and we've got 420,000 households that need it, and there's less than 200,000 dwellings. The next part of this slide that's very interesting, and it was quite surprising when we saw it, was this huge spike in 2021 of stock that's affordable to Q2 households. And we do put that down to the conditions, the things that were happening around COVID. So the census was taken in August 2021. And of course, I think Melbourne was still in lockdown. The lockdowns had happened. Everything was disrupted. Borders were closed. People had left cities, coming back. Landlords had reduced rents as well. And I think Eliza would know more about this. And vacancy rates were up. And I think things had just started to change. Some of the regulations, the interventions had started to be wound back. And we were just, in August 2021, just on the uptick of rents starting to go up. And I'm sure Eliza can talk about this afterwards, but what's happened post-census.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's really quite a startling adjustment in that graph, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, we would have expected a lot of that stock to actually be in the next segment, in the R3. That would follow the trend that had been happening. But it wasn't. So very little supply for Q1 and then this influx for Q2. So the other thing we can do with census data is we can add in the incomes of the households that occupy the stock. And this is really important because this brings in the availability part of our analysis. So the R1 stock, there's hardly any of it. Not even half of it is occupied by Q1 households. In any of those years, it's less than half is occupied. Otherwise, it's taken up by higher income households. The R2 stock, similar story. You've got less than a third that's actually occupied by Q2 households, but you've got a large number of Q1 households in it because they don't have enough stock to start with. And then the rest of it is occupied by higher income households. And it's somewhat, I mean, our segments of interest are the R1 and the R2. So it's a really, important thing to do is to show not only what stock is there, but who gets it. I mean, this is the private market. We don't allocate stock relating, on sort of what the household income is. No. But that's the reality of what happens.
Can I ask you, Maggie, while you're on this slide and the previous one, looking at the stock distribution, this is obviously looking at the whole of Australia, but how much does that vary, I guess, at smaller geographic regions? To what extent do capital cities, for example, have a different experience to more regional locations?
Yep. So we definitely look at, metropolitan versus non-metropolitan. And that big spike, the COVID spike there, didn't really occur outside of the capital cities. There is an increase and at each census it's got that the volume of that stock has gone up, but nowhere near that extreme spike that occurred in the capital cities. Most of the R1 stock is the stock that's affordable for Q1 households.
Yep.
2/3, I think, of that is located outside of capital cities. So inside capital cities,
it's smaller. Yeah,
it's much, much smaller. It's almost doesn't exist. So there's definitely a spatial dimension to this. Yeah, and a little bit, the slides down, we'll see the affordability outcomes for the households. They vary spatially as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, we'll keep moving through.
Okay. We've got that one. Yep. So this one, it's another way of illustrating the problem. So looking at Q1 and Q2 households separately, we can see that they have separate issues in the private rental market. So Q1 households here, this is illustrating how the shortages work. The red bar there is the number of households. So that's the number of Q1 private rental households. The grey bar is the number of dwellings that's affordable to them. That's that R1 stock. Straight away, just looking across the census years, in every year, there are more households than there are dwellings, affordable dwellings. So Q1 households have an outright shortage of stock that's affordable to them. It just doesn't exist. If every dwelling was allocated to the household, they still wouldn't be enough. The blue bar there that's the number of Q1 households that are actually in and occupying an affordable dwelling. So it was 33% of them were in affordable dwellings in 1996, and then it drops down to 2021, where it's only 18%. So 18% of the Q1 households are paying an affordable rent. Yep. And the other notable thing here is that there was no COVID spike for Q1 households. There was no influx of affordable dwellings. That was we're up to $225 a week. Yeah. So that's Q1s.
And can you talk to us about Q2? Would be interesting. Whoops, we've gone too far.
Sorry. Yep.
Sorry. I'll let you drive that.
All right, back to Q2. Q2s are a different story. The red bars are the number of households. The grey bars are the number of affordable dwellings. You can see in every year there are more dwellings than there are households.
Yep.
But again, this is where availability kicks in. And when they're not able to access that stock, there becomes a shortage. So it's a shortage of affordable and available dwellings. So for 2021, it's that difference between the top of the red and the blue.
Yeah.
152. So even with that massive COVID spike as well, there are still Q2 households that are paying an unaffordable rent. And we enumerate that as 152,000. Affordability for them was getting worse over at least the 2006 to 2016 period, where 76% were paying affordable, 68 to 64%, but then it bounced up again with that influx of stock to 73% paying affordable.
Yeah,
we all know what's happened post census. So
yeah, and Maggie, there was a question there. That's purely private rental dwellings, isn't it?
This is only private rental. Yep.
Thank you.
So it's paying rent to a landlord or to a person who doesn't live in the household. Yep.
Yep.
So that's the two very different positions of the Q1 and the Q2 households in the private rental market. And do you want to have a quick look at the shortage estimates spatially?
Here's the spatial question.
Yeah.
Great.
Is that good? So there's lots and lots of numbers in the report and lots of estimates about shortages. I've just put up the percentages. So this is like the affordability outcomes for each of the income groups.
Yeah.
So the proportion of them paying unaffordable rents. We've looked at the Australian one, we had the 82%. Metro regions, much worse, 90% of Q1 households paying unaffordable. Non-metro, better, 70%. Sydney, probably unsurprisingly, 93% of Q1 households paying an unaffordable rent. And that has not changed really since 2006. Yeah. Melbourne hasn't changed much, got a bit worse. So you can see the capital cities are quite bad. But then we also have like the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast are also up there with similar sort of figures of paying unaffordable. The Q2 households on the right-hand side are doing better and improved with the COVID spike.
Yeah.
So Sydney went to, changed from 71% paying unaffordable, which is really high for the Q2 segment. That was last census, the 2016 census, down to 53%, so just half.
Yeah. Just half.
Yeah, just half.
Yeah. Just 10% of the households. Yeah.
Yeah. But I look, I'd love to run a census now and see what the figures are.
Yeah, well, that's going to be really, really interesting. And I just wonder if you've got any more slides for us there, Maggie, because I was keen to ask Eliza her thoughts on, you obviously keep your finger on the pulse of rental markets around the country too, and just, I guess, moving ahead from the 2021 census to bring in a bit of narrative around where things have gone since. Can you fill that picture out a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So are you happy for me to whiz through the slides to that graph?
Yeah, sure. You've got a graph. It's the next one.
Oh, it's right there. Yeah, great.
You're done.
And first, I just wanted to say, Maggie, thank you so much for your research and your insights today. Thanks to AHURI for having me, and also wanting to acknowledge the traditional landowners. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land today. So as Maggie pointed out at the onset of COVID, and is well documented in the research as well, there were some big shifts in the economy, population, government policy that did lead to a bit of a decline in rents initially at the onset of the pandemic. And we put that at a peak to trough decline nationally of just 2% in rent values before it started tightening up again. So what you're looking at here is rolling annual growth in CoreLogic's rent value, which is based off of inputs of advertised rents. So it's a pretty good measure of how new rent values are changing, if you like. And you can see that we go from this very subdued growth rate in the onset of the pandemic to factors starting to push up rent values. Annual growth in rents peaked at about 9.5% through late 2021. And this wasn't anything to do with the reopening of Australian borders to overseas migration at the time. 2021 was very much about a change in household composition, households breaking up and spreading out across the rental market. And really, once we started to fight inflation too, the increase in the cash rate subsequently leads to an increase in mortgage rates, and that leads to a short-term disruption in investor activity as well, which restricts new rental supply at the same time that we were seeing increased demand for rentals. But as we did, open up Australian borders, that was essentially adding to rental demand to an already tightened rental market. And that's how you get that continuation of strong annual growth. And it's very different to what we saw in the 2010s, which, at least in the private rental market, annual growth in rents averaged 2% a year throughout the entirety of the 2010s. So even though this was an environment in which there was less and less affordable dwellings to low income segments of households, I think for those on median to high incomes, rental growth was pretty sustainable throughout booms in investor activity in the 2010s.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's great to have, I guess, that chart's, showing since that census date how the market as a whole has. I guess I'm interested, both of you, really, to I guess reflect on also what that has meant for the lower end of the income distribution. I mean, we're talking, the bottom 20% particularly, but to reiterate, it's the bottom 40%. So this, we're not talking a minority here. We're talking still a large number of Australian households. How do they sit in alongside that overall market movement?
I can take it
please.
on the supply that's affordable for those Q1 households. It's not there. It's too low, and I think it needed to be at like $225 a week.
Yep.
For them to afford it. And the market, and this project shows, because we've looked long term, we've shown that the market just does not supply that.
Yep.
And I don't think it will. Eliza, you can suggest whether or not the market's ever going to supply. I mean, even if we could be a bit more generous and it's $250 a week or $280 a week, I don't think the private market is going to ever supply that. It hasn't done in the past. It's not doing it now. There's no reason for it to be doing it in the future. Is there, Eliza?
No. So, I mean, one thing that we've sort of talked about briefly before the start of the webinar, and for context, I have looked up the 20th percentile rent value in Australia, which is currently, CoreLogic puts it at $508 a week.
Yeah.
Median is sitting at around $630 a week in the private rental market. But yeah, we talked about how the supply of rental property, the status quo in Australia, is basically the women incentive of investors. If the interest rate settings are right, if the capital growth settings are right, if the tax settings are right. And as your research has demonstrated through the decades, it's not been enough to create adequate supply of affordable rentals. You need to counteract the private rental market with a very deliberate supply of affordable housing.
Yeah.
That is some form of social housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, typically.
It has to be, outside of the private market, managed outside, not profit and outside the market.
And so to pick up on that chart you were showing and the recent changes, I guess that is more being felt then in that next income quintile, the 40 to 60% of the distribution range, I would expect, and possibly even higher than that. Eliza, do you want to comment on that? I think that, and that's where what that curve in your chart showed is that growth in value is, given that we're not seeing any change at those lower income quintiles, is that being felt in terms of out of pocket expenses each week for households in Australia? Is that being felt by that middle band, or is it how high up into the income distribution is that impact being experienced?
Yeah, so rental affordability, we estimate, has deteriorated at the high, middle, and low end of the market.
Yep.
One of the important implications of this research that Maggie's worked on and presenting is the fact that the composition of the private rental market has changed. So you not only have the demand for affordable rentals, but you have relatively high income households that are also facing increased rent values. And it was noted in the Productivity Commission's review into the Housing and Homelessness Agreement in 2022 that when high income households face increased rents, they look to the next most affordable market and they create more competition for rental properties in those mid to lower priced stock levels. And for lower income households, there may be no next most affordable market to go to. And so that's where we've seen increased pressure on specialist homelessness services and people going from the private rental market to a really vulnerable situation. So that was a very important use and application of this research for us who measure the private rental market, is to look at that cascading effect. And in fact, if we look at some of the biggest increases in rent values since the start of the pandemic, a lot of it has been concentrated in areas where rents were on the relatively affordable or the relatively cheap the spectrum. So Bunbury in WA, rent values there have increased 60% since the start of the pandemic. Wide Bay in Queensland, rent values up 50%. I saw someone asking about the ACT earlier. That, you know, with the ACT, it's interesting because they're one of the few areas that has put a kind of control on rent value increases tied to the rent component of the CPI. And it hasn't led to a big investor retreat. It hasn't led to a blowout in rent values or pressure in the rental market as much. Rent values are still up a sizable 16% in that market since the start of the pandemic. But yeah, I think that's an interesting observation as well. There has been a lot of variation in the extent of rent growth across the cities as well.
And maybe that lower segment, there is more scope for increase, isn't there? I mean, if it's already at an upper level, the rent, you can increase it by only so much. But maybe it's the affordable properties that have greater scope for a larger rent increase.
Totally, more scope for increase and more just more demand from different income segments. The transformation of some areas through the pandemic as well, those that were more feasible for high income professional remote workers to live in. But generally it is the cheaper end of the rental market where we've seen the biggest increases in rent value since the pandemic started.
Yeah. And our project, we never argued that a Q3 household has to spend 30% of their income, so they should be in the R3 stock. It's not like that. I mean, in some ways, it could be a reflection that the stock is quite good, and that you don't have to spend that much, and you can get a dwelling that's in the right location and suits your purposes, you know, for where you are. And if you are trying to save a deposit for a house, you want to minimise, you know, the amount of rent as much as you can. So maybe the R2 stock is pretty good quality and well located, you know.
The subject of a different research project, I think, to explore that other dimension to the issue. But I did want to pick up, Eliza, you mentioned before about the ACT and I guess different rental regulation there. To, I guess, look at, you know, to start, you know, talking about what should be done in relation to what this research has, you know, consistently revealed over the years. I mean, Maggie, you've already mentioned that decline in social supply and that being, you know, a critical part of it. But what about the other things that governments can or have or are doing or could do? What are those other things? You know, to what extent are other interventions, you know, for example, you know, rent controls or caps or things like that, other forms of, you know, household subsidy, to what extent are they able to actually have any impact on particularly the lowest income quintile, but, you know, even, you know, the lower half of the income distribution? Like where are those policies having effect, and what sort of effects are they able to have? I'm interested in what both of you think about that.
I mean, I would just note as well, I think in the front of the report, Maggie, it talks about the very empowering effect of increased household stimulus as well for lower income households and their ability to keep up with rents. So, you know, just that very basic increase of assistance to households that need it from a direct social payment perspective.
Yeah.
I think the RA, Commonwealth Rent Assistance, which still doesn't solve the supply problem.
No.
And I think there's evidence to show that even it really doesn't close the affordability gap all that much. But again, but it's there, and I would support that.
Yeah. So again, part of that supply issue, because we're so dependent on the private sector to deliver that, it's very hard to do right now. You know, construction costs have gone up about 30% since the start of COVID. There's a shortage of construction workers to the tune of about 90,000 people, according to Build Skills Australia. There's not a lot of appetite for new dwellings because the pre-sales aren't there amid a high interest rate environment. So you definitely need to look at the deliberate supply of social housing, or, you know, if it's more efficient or innovative to do so through the community housing sector as well. That's not really my area of expertise, but certainly if you can find innovations in that space, that's really important. And from a demand perspective, there's the tax element. So making sure that existing dwellings are efficiently utilised. A lot of people point to the state of Victoria is in a really tough position because the additional taxes that have been introduced for investors are thought to maybe deter new investment in housing stock. But to their credit, Melbourne has one of the lowest rent values of the capital city markets, which is not to say that it's fully able to provide for those that need social housing either, but it's certainly moving, I think, in more of the right direction for more accessible housing. And you can even look at the purchasing market where values are kind of flat, falling. Often when we talk about residential real estate, we might characterize that as poor market performance. But the flip side of that is that it's more affordable, and Victoria actually accounts for the highest share of first home buyer finance that goes out at the moment as well.
I think Melbourne has a greater spread of rents, of rent prices and of home purchase prices, I think, rather than Sydney where it's very concentrated. I think Melbourne's had a bigger spread in those prices. The other one that often comes up, and Eliza might know more about it, but build to rent, I think, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that the prices there will probably be more like at a Q3 level, an R3 sort of stock for higher up. They're still not going to be affordable for the very low or even just the low incomes, but it can take pressure off other segments of the, other rent segments in the market. So again, it is a supply increase, which is good, and it might take pressure off, but I think that they will be too high. Any new build is not going to be affordable for, I would think, even a Q2 household. I mean, hopefully it's well located, but so I'm thinking that I don't know if Eliza can add anything else to the build to rent argument.
Yeah, I think the piece with build to rent is that it's not feasible to deliver affordable rents because of the tax structures. So again, it comes back to the way that we've set up our taxation to favour individual, your mum and dad investors, if you like. For example, the way that land tax is structured. If you own one investment property as an individual investor, it's likely that you'll, slide under the land tax threshold for paying that. But if you're a build to rent developer, investor who owns a whole block of apartments, you're much more likely to be subject to land tax. So build to rent could work. It could even provide affordable dwellings, but it needs a heck of a lot of subsidy in terms of the government making the tax settings favourable. And if that's the direction that we want to go in, again, that's just a very deliberate policy decision. I would add there is a layer of complexity there where we're essentially handing the subsidies over to big corporations to own land and housing rather than individuals. Whether that's better or worse, I mean, I feel a little ambivalent about it, but I think there's a lot of debate to be had about build to rent. At the moment, it doesn't really stack up.
Yeah, and arguably, of course, community housing is a form of build to rent. Just
true.
The corporation involved is not a for-profit one, but
not for profit. No.
Clearly there's ongoing consideration of that nascent or fairly emergent in terms of the private sector, a more emergent sector of the rental market, but clearly one that is on the increase at the moment. Assuming that and other mechanisms to increase the supply of rental property, so property that is deliberately in a sense quarantined for a rental purpose rather than properties that I guess slip in and out of ownership and into rental. Eliza, are you expecting that were we to have suddenly a much more significant number of properties that were dedicated to rental that would I guess start to perhaps maybe in the middle of the income distribution relieve some pressure from on the other stock that perhaps is currently occupied by those on higher incomes but who are choosing to rent for whatever reason?
Yeah, I think like Maggie said before, the additional supply helps through this kind of filtering effect of more broadly relieving pressure on the market. There might be something to think about in terms of how increasing the supply of rental property crowds out the owner occupation. And, you know, I think part of the reason where we are now is because of the long-term decline in home ownership rates, creating more pressure on the private rental system. So I think, especially in the context of new housing being hard to deliver, there kind of needs to be a focus and a bit of a triage, if you like, on funding for social and affordable to protect those and create more of a buffer between the private rental market and homelessness.
Just on the looking at the households now, I guess turning our attention away from the stock as such, but Maggie, there's been a few questions that came through when people registered, I guess, interested in particular segments of the community, people interested in, I guess, what this means for young people. You know, a number of decades ago, it was a bit of a rite of passage, you know, to move the rental market from the family home before, you know, ultimately, you know, buying a house. That seems a long time ago now, but you know, what does this mean? You know, in terms of the results of your research, what does this mean for young people specifically? And people are also interested in, I guess, hearing about what it means for older people too, people in their retirement years, and I guess, you know, especially those who haven't achieved, you know, full home ownership throughout the course of their life. You know, what does that mean for that? So those two groups, the younger and the older, we'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, definitely the older people. I mean, we know that there's going to be more older people in rental, relying on the private rental market in older age. It's happening now, and what could also be interesting to look at is whether or not older people are changing their living arrangements, like the younger people who are staying home longer with mum and dad, and they'll do their study from home rather than, you know, moving out to the share house with the other students. It would be really interesting to know if older people are adjusting their living arrangements and maybe moving back in with their adult children. But we know that demand is increasing, and they're on fixed incomes, and many of them won't have enough superannuation to top up their, you know, pension payments or whatever it might be. And so there's a real trouble looming there as well. And a lot of it is actually being realised now, I think, with increased rates of homelessness amongst older people. So again, because their incomes will be largely fixed if they've left the labour market, we're going to need this supply for at whatever level is affordable to them. And that is going to have to be a government intervention. Again, I would think any private intervention without huge subsidies will be just too expensive for an older person on a fixed income. And at the other end, for younger people, move out with more friends, more incomes. I'm not sure what we've seen evidence, and in our report, we've got that exploratory sort of chapter at the end that, and certainly looking at the survey of income and housing, which is another ABS survey, household structures and compositions have changed, and there is empirical evidence there to say that kids, and we probably know this is common sense, but empirically it's there that the 20-somethings are staying home longer.
Yeah.
You know, it's a real impact on household formation and becoming independent and, you know, getting on with your life, leaving home, to not be able to do that because your rental market is too expensive. We need a rental market. We're not, you know, we know that it's a transition. Well, it used to be transitional. Now we know long-term renting used to be 10 years. Now it's like 20 years, and there'll be people who never leave it. So, yeah, how it all fits for young people, I don't know. I think we're seeing it. They're staying home longer. Yeah.
So, in a sense, some of that, some of the findings from your research, in a way, could potentially be seen as an undercount of that number, in the sense that there are a number of households that are not even emerging
We didn't sort of create that last volume of households, and we didn't get that number. But there's definitely evidence there that says that the shortages they're an underestimate.
Yeah,
because there's quite a few people that don't leave home, can't form an independent household. Yeah, and they would also be in those, or should be in those figures. Yeah.
We're getting towards the end of our time, and I am not wanting to leave on a down in the dumps sort of perspective, but it does feel there's a big task here to really start to address what has been, and I think not just your research in this report, but the work over the years of this series of research. It does show the growth in need for housing for people in the lowest income quintile, particularly, and the second one as well. That just continues to grow, and I guess I'm looking ahead to 2026. I'm not expecting the next edition of this report to really bring us too much joy beyond that. How quickly can we actually start to really address this by that provision of housing, which does need to be in many ways outside of the market? I mean, there is a role for the private sector, but a lot of this needs to be done, and we're seeing action from government, federally and state governments nationally, to set targets for social housing supply, committing much more significant sums of money to the problem than we've seen in previous years. How long is this going to take before we start to see, I guess, some, not solving the problem, but at least some turning around of the ship and starting to, to move in the opposite direction?
Big question. I think what we have to do first is catch up.
Yeah.
I mean, we're so far behind with social housing that there's a lot of work to do just to catch up. And the numbers that come out of, the federal government and the housing ministers, they confuse me with what they're going to build and in what time frame, and if they have this much and that much. Are they realistic? I think there's quite a bit of research to say that they're not realistic, not in current conditions, but we have to start somewhere. So bring it on, start building, but make it affordable for the very low income households. That's what we need to be asking when they you hear a lot about affordable housing. Ask, who is it affordable for? Or what area is it affordable for? Not that it's a sub-market rent, but
sure.
Who is that housing affordable for? What types of households? Because I bet they're probably not talking about the very low end. They're probably talking about up the income scale a bit.
So, Eliza, what's your level of optimism about the current?
I think what Maggie's research points out as well is that this is a crisis decades in the making, and something like that takes a long time to turn around. I think in the short term, we're going to see more adapting on the demand side, more share housing, people being forced out to maybe more regional, rural, affordable markets. I think at least we have a government that acknowledges the situation we're in and is committing a bit more to social and affordable, but we need more still, way more still. And the other thing too is in the private rental market, for that total rent measure that we're looking at, we might start to see that normalize in the next few years. We might start to see annual rent growth trend lower as things like overseas migration normalizes, investors get back into the market when interest rates come down, what have you. But we need to keep this conversation going, even if there's a cyclical decline in median income household rent costs and things like that.
Yeah, keep that focus on that very low end, because they've been lost over the decades, really. That problem has been there for 20 years. And once the rest of it maybe picks up and evens off, we'll hopefully not forget about them again.
Well, thank you both. We've reached the end of our webinar today. I want to thank both of you and thank everyone else for your participation. And if you're interested in hearing more about AHURI webinars on our future or current research, then just please keep an eye on our website or sign up for the AHURI news. And a quick reminder again that we'd appreciate your feedback on our webinar. We've been a bit experimental today, tried a new format. We got your questions ahead of time and just interested in knowing how you felt that went. And I've just had a little bit of an eye on the chat as that's progressed. It's been quite lively. There's been quite a bit of engagement in the chat, which has been really great to see. So hopefully you got something out of today and that you've been able to connect with colleagues as well as tune into what Maggie and Eliza have had to contribute today. So look, thank you, Maggie, thank you, Eliza, and everyone. We look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.